In this exercise, we're going to select a different material, and we're going to modify a few basic attributes of that material. I've saved my progress as singlepointlight.psd. It's found inside the 05 materials folder. And with my 3D panel open, I'm going to click on sphere material in order to select it. And we're going to switch to a different material in the list here. I'm going to click the down pointing arrowhead. And materials, by the way, are a combination of a bunch of different attributes. Most notably, we've got a diffuse color or texture, which is the base color of the object before it's lit and before we get the highlights and the shadows and the reflections and the refractions and everything else that adds to that base color. Plus, many of these materials include bump maps, which are surface maps that rough up the shape. Anyway, I'm going to select one that doesn't have a bump map, which is this guy right here. It's Gemstone Ruby. And in my case, that's going to re-invoke the ray tracing process. And it's going to be pretty slow, so we're going to speed it up here. But I want you to see how the program kind of hangs at this point. The pop-up menu stays up on screen. You have to click in order to get rid of it. And if you do that, you're going to interrupt the ray tracing process. Also, we don't see our values update over here on the right side of the panel. The opacity of this effect is not 100%. Anyway, I'm going to click for a second to interrupt the process. Click again in order to hide that panel. Now we can see the real values that are at work. And now I'm going to go up to the 3D menu and choose Resume Progressive Render so it can continue from where it left off. Now I want you to note this opacity value. It's not the same as the opacity here inside the Layers panel because the opacity is applied to the front face of the sphere in this case, as well as the back face. So the translucency levels are building on top of each other. And the effect gets even more intense over here on the sides. So the very edges where the sphere is turning around, that's where you're going to see the biggest buildup of opacity, whereas you'll get your most translucent areas in the center of the shape. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and click in order to stop this render process because I'm not thinking that this is the most realistic Ruby effect I've ever seen. But I do want you to notice a couple of things here. We've got a bit of reflection coming off of the grass down here at the bottom of the image and from the sky as well. And we have some refraction. Now, refraction is the amount of distortion applied to light as it passes through the object. So refraction only becomes important at lower opacity levels. In our case, we're seeing the most obvious refraction here in the form of the ground level reflected at the top of the object and some of the clouds down here at the bottom. All right, what I'm going to do, though, just to get rid of the ray trace, is I'm going to switch to scene and I'm going to change the quality back to interactive painting. So we can make a few changes without having to incessantly interrupt the ray trace. And I'm going to switch back to sphere material. And I want this to be something of a sapphire effect. So I'm going to click on this diffuse color. Because notice, if I hover over the word diffuse, I do not see a pop-up texture, which means there is no texture at work. It's all about the color. I'm going to click on that. And to get sapphire, I figured it should be a hue value of 210. I'll leave the saturation and brightness alone. Click OK. And I don't see any reason why the opacity should be this low. You can't see through sapphire or, for that matter, ruby like a pair of sunglasses. So I'm going to raise the opacity level to 88%. We'll revisit bump and environment later, so I'm going to skip ahead to reflection. Now, if you want to turn the thing into a blue-colored mirror, then you would take this value up to 100%. That's not what we want. I do want some reflection, though, so I'll take this up to 35%. Now, illumination is a little bit of a conceit. It's the color of the light that's put off by the object. Now, in real life, that kind of illumination only happens with light sources. However, it's a great way, by adding a little bit of color illumination here, it's a great way to make an object shine, which can be useful for gems and metals and other shiny materials. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this color swatch, change the hue value to 210, and click OK. All right, gloss and shine, you may recall from the previous chapter. Gloss is the size or the spread, if you prefer, of the highlights that are bouncing off the object. Shine is the intensity of those highlights. So I'm going to take the gloss value up to 100%. A shine value of 82% is just fine. Specular is the color of the brightest point in the highlight. Generally, you want that to be white, but you can calm it down by dialing in a darker color if you want. Ambient light, that's the color of the natural light that just surrounds the object. So again, it's another way for the object to self-illuminate. I'm going to click on ambient, and I'm going to change the hue value to, once again, 210, uniform across the board. Now, regarding refraction, the refraction index can vary from 1 to 3. And just to give you a sense of what that means, if the object were space, it were just a vacuum, then we would have no refraction, and as a result, the refraction index would be 1. If the object is supposed to be water or ice, the refraction index in the real world is about 1.3. If it's a sugar-based soft drink that's translucent, anything from Gatorade to Coca-Cola, then it's going to be around 1.4 to 1.5. If it's a glass, and this could be a highball or it could be a wine glass, something along those lines, then it's 1.5 to 1.6. If it's a gemstone, it's going to be right around 1.77 typically. So I'm going to leave my refraction value exactly as it is. And then finally, diamond has a refraction index of about 2.4. So just a few examples to bear in mind. Obviously, you want to change this value to something that looks good. All right, having dialed in a few adjustments, I'm going to click on Scene here at the top of the list, and then I'll change the quality back to Ray Trace Draft. And just for the sake of expediency, we're going to go ahead and super speed through this ray trace process. But even as it works, check out those reflections. You can actually see that seam right there. That is not a seam in the object itself. That's a seam in a larger panorama that the sphere just happens to be reflecting. And we'll ultimately have to take care of that seam once we render out the trio of chrome spheres. But in the meantime, this is good enough. Gives you a sense of how materials work. In the next exercise, we're going to create a little bit of surface texture by adding a bump map.